Hello, Pastor Adam Carnell here at Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Randolph, New Jersey. And I'm going to present a book review, just a brief one. It's on a book I just finished called Satan. I first saw this book on a shelf in the University of Glasgow Library in Glasgow, Scotland. And I was kind of walking by, scanning the shelf. And when I saw this spine, I stopped dead in my tracks. Thought, what is that? A book called Satan? And then they're like, Sheet and Ward. Okay, they're a Catholic publishing house. Published a lot of books on G.K. Chesterton, one of my favorite authors. So what is Satan? And I picked it up and flipped through it, and I immediately carried it to the counter and checked it out and brought it back to my flat in Glasgow. And when I got back to the United States, I found a copy online and I bought it. It was shipped over from the UK. It's out of print. It's hard to find. It's pretty rare. But I finished it recently, and I just have to give a book review on it because I have to talk about it. This is, for me, sort of a paradigm-shifting book. You know, every few years, usually you read one book that really blows you away, and you relate it to everything from then on, to your faith and to relationships and to the way that you perceive the world. And for me, this is one of those books, Satan. This was originally published in French and translated and published in English by Sheet and Ward in 1951. And it's, to my knowledge, this is the only printing of this book, the only edition, and it's been out of print since 1951. It's a collection of essays on Satan, on demonology, on aspects of Satan and the demon's activity, and even on writers and artists' conceptions of the Prince of Darkness, the Prince of the Power of the Air, as Paul calls him. And the essays are all written by European monks and theology professors and academics and psychologists, mainly French. So most of the contributors are French monks, Benedictines, Jesuits, and Dominican monks. So an incredibly interesting group of writers. Most of them are unknown. A couple of them, like Henri Irénée Marou, is widely published. I think he wrote on, he's written tons of books on the Middle Ages and I think maybe on the history of education. I could be wrong about that. But most of the other contributors were probably well known in these Catholic academic circles in France in the 40s and 50s, but they've since been forgotten. What I found fascinating about this book too is that it's coming out in the late 40s, early 50s, written by French monks. I mean, these are men who experienced World War II, the horrors of the Holocaust, of the German invasion and occupation, of the struggle and the resistance, and the liberation of France by the Allies, and the final defeat of Germany in 1945. So these are men who were actively watching and experiencing and participating in that history. And the final essay in the volume is on Satan and Hitler, and it's written by a man named Dom Alois Mager, an Austrian monk. And this was a man who every day during the Second World War would go into the balcony of his apartment, up in the balcony, and would say the rite of exorcism over the Obersalzberg, where Hitler had a house in Bavaria, right there by the border with Austria. So this man would exorcise the Obersalzberg and Hitler and the top Nazi brass every day. And then right at the end of World War II, about 1946, he died from exhaustion and overwork. And I'm sure that the other contributors in this book also have fascinating stories. But let me just get into, let me read part of the introduction, and then I'll give you a brief overview of the book itself and then give you my estimation of it. In the introduction, we read this by an author, Charles Moeller. He says, "Contemporary man, confronted by the problem of Satan, is divided against himself by a twofold reaction, apparently self-contradictory. He is on the one hand fascinated by this mysterious personage, and on the other hand almost totally skeptical as to his existence and influence on the course of events. His morbid preoccupation with every species of the abnormal and the sensational, his insatiable need for ever more violent stimuli, his restless curiosity regarding the metaphysical and the occult, All these things are further degradations of an already superstitious religiosity. The devil, who is a past master in the bizarre, cannot help but be a source of fascination. Besides, he has staged a dazzling comeback in modern literature. At the same time, there is an almost total skepticism as to his actual existence. He is bundled away into the attic of discarded mythologies. Of course, nobody believes anymore in the pantomime demon king, flashily got up in horns, red tongue, and eyes of coal, rather as a confidence trickster in his working clothes. On the contrary, his trappings are in the latest fashion. But his influence has been watered down to a series of dangerous repressions within the personality. Fascinating. Throughout the book, that sentiment is sort of the thread connecting everything. What Charles Muller is saying is doubtlessly inspired by Baudelaire, Charles Baudelaire, who said something like, the devil's greatest trick is to convince men that he does not exist, right? The devil's greatest tactic of all is to make sure that people are not aware of his existence, that people are not thinking about him, that people are not conscious of him. That thread unites all of the essays in this book. So let me break down this book a bit. First of all, there are about 20 very interesting illustrations and paintings and even pottery and sculpture in the book. Plates, right? Prints. So it's well illustrated. The authors are all mostly Catholics, as I said, mostly monks, as I said, but they're from a variety of theological faculties, Strasbourg, Paris, Lyon, etc., and elsewhere across Europe. And they're from a variety of disciplines. There are exegetical theologians, there are psychiatrists and psychologists, there are historians, there are preachers. And together with all these voices, you get this really wide-ranging study. One of the most incredible studies, honestly, learned and wide-ranging that I've ever read. The first part is called Satan's Existence and Nature. And the first essay is called The Devil Himself by Walter Pharrell. So these essays are looking at the Old and New Testaments and looking at Christian theology, specifically St. Thomas Aquinas, who deals at length with angels and demons. And it's giving 20th century people an overview of what historically or metaphysically the church has said about Satan. He's a supernatural being, a fallen angel. He was once high and exalted in heaven and fell down, Christians say, because of his pride or perhaps because of his envy. And with him, he took a whole bunch of the heavenly host. And what intrigued me about this early part is it's not really given into speculation, right? When did the fall happen? How long did the fall happen? Did it take 3 seconds? Did it take 1 second? Some church fathers suggested that. How many of the angels left? Was it 1/3 of the angels, as Milton says, based on an obscure verse in Revelation, about 1/3 of the stars falling? It's not given in speculation. It looks at the data of the Old and New Testaments, and it formulates introductory teachings based on all of that data. And then it concludes with looking at what St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila had to say about the devil. Just fascinating little theological studies. Second part is the place of the devil outside Christianity. So different scholars here look at the devil in primitive religions. Primitive not being some kind of an insult, but primitive meaning archaic. Where do the earliest peoples and non-modern peoples believe about the devil and demons? These contributors look at early Native American beliefs, and then Mazdian dualism. So that would be Persian religion, Zoroastrianism. And then they also take a look even at the Yazidis and the Yazidi view of the devil. Just very interesting. I've never read anything about what the Yazidis believe about the devil or what the Persians think about the devil. So this was an incredibly enlightening portion of the book. Part 3 is the longest part of the book. It's about 150 pages. It's called Possession and Diabolism. So here I met what I found to be the most helpful essay in the volume. It's called Demoniacs in the Gospel by Monsignor F.M. Catarine. And in that, he just does an overview of every demon possession in the New Testament and basically shows what they have in common, what the demons do, what they're capable of, and he draws some conclusions from that. And that was incredibly interesting. He specifically focuses on the Gerasene demoniac in Mark chapter 5, and does some careful exegetical work there. And what he concludes basically that the demons are very obsequious. Sorry, I'm not saying that correctly, but they are ready to bow down in fear and in kind of a cowering anxiety before Jesus Christ. The demons operate with lies, with false information, but the demons recognize the divinity of Christ. The demons bow down before Christ, and the demons are named. Legion is his name, and the demons do not want to be cast down back to the abyss. They would rather go inside of animals, the herd of pigs on the banks of the Sea of Galilee. Demons are also capable, once they inhabit a person, capable of preternatural things like breaking chains, scraping yourself with rocks and not dying from the wounds, living outside and not dying of exposure, etc., etc. And so in some of these essays, when some exorcists themselves are writing about their experience in exorcisms, they point back to these demonic possessions in the Gospels and say, basically, that these are a few of the signs of true possession. Preternatural strength or other abilities like levitation, the ability to know intimate details about the exorcist himself or other people in the room and then exploiting the situation, and speaking in a voice that does not belong to the possessed person. So speaking in a demonic voice, as we see all across the Gospels, it's the demon that speaks. We know who you are, the Son of God, right? The demons are speaking in fear with their own voice from inside of these possessed people. And also the ability to speak in a language that the possessed person did not know or has never known. So exorcists commonly will speak in Latin and ask for the demon to respond in Latin. And even if it's a completely uneducated peasant, if that person is demon-possessed, the demon is able to speak back in Latin and understand Latin perfectly. And then exorcists will also occasionally speak in Greek or French, German, and other languages. Just fascinating. And to hear these exorcists write these articles, I mean, these are not uneducated fools. These are professional practicing psychologists, theologians with advanced degrees in theology, in religious studies and philosophy, and in psychology. And they're practitioners of these things, and they're trained to know when there's a demon exorcism. Another interesting part of this book is in this section there are a few articles on pseudo-possession. So famous cases where people pretended to be possessed, but sort of showed their hand, showed that they were bluffing because they did not demonstrate strength, super strength, speaking in other languages, levitation, some sort of knowledge of other people's secret sins. And the exorcist just freely admit, yeah, these are pseudo possessions. You have to be very careful when you're actually trying to exorcise someone and determine if someone is demon possessed. Just fascinating. I mean, as a Lutheran pastor, I've never heard this or thought about this much ever before. And in the Demoniacs in the Gospel chapter article, he makes a strong distinction between those who are sick in the Gospels and those who are demon-possessed. And occasionally there are people with a spirit of infirmity. It almost seems as if they were simultaneously plagued and attacked by a demon, and that demon was somehow the cause of the injury or the illness or exacerbated it. And so when Jesus heals and exorcises that person, a demon leaves them. In other cases, like the woman with the issue of blood, she touches the hem of Jesus' garment and her bleeding stops and she is healed. She was not possessed. Other times there are people who are possessed and don't have illnesses, at least that the gospel writers mention. So you have to draw a distinction between those. Not every mental illness is caused by a demon. Not every illness is caused by a demon. And not every possession causes an illness or a mental possession. But again, exorcists are trained to notice these differences and to deal with them. The last couple of essays in part 3, Possession and Diabolism, deal with the church and witchcraft in the 16th century and Satanism in the 16th century. There was an explosion of both the practice of Satanism and black Sabbaths and witchcraft and sorcery in the 16th century, and the repression and punishment of sorcerers and witches by the church, Catholic and Protestant. It's sort of astonishing. But again, in that chapter, it's written by Émile Brouet. He says we have to be careful in saying that there were just mass genocides of witches or something. In a lot of cases, people were accused of witchcraft and they were acquitted. I mean, in thousands upon thousands of cases. In other cases, they were accused of witchcraft and they were banished. So suspected witches were not always automatically killed by the Inquisition. And he points out, importantly, that to conduct an Inquisition was incredibly expensive. And so that was enough for most towns to say, if that person is a witch, let's just have her talk to the priest and be done with it. We're not going to try her in a court. It's too expensive. So interesting historical perspective. Part 4 is called The Devil in Art and Literature. Love this passage. These are the chapters in this part. The Devil in Art, the Devil in the Divine Comedy, that'd be Dante. The Figure of Satan in Milton and Blake, John Milton and William Blake. John Milton, the great poet who wrote Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, Samson Agonistes, and William Blake, who wrote very interesting poetry, Songs of Innocence and Experience, Jerusalem, and was an artist and an engraver. Fascinating chapter on how they conceived of Satan. Balzac in the End of Satan, that'd be Honoré Balzac, the early 19th century French writer. Turning point of Romanticism, The Devil in Gogol and Dostoevsky, the two great Russian novelists, and The Devil in Contemporary Literature, that was a very dense chapter, and also that was about 40 pages long. And the author, Claude Edmond Magny, talks about Paul Valéry, Paul Claudel, Mallarmé, Georges Bernanos, and other French authors in the 20th century who aren't so popular today, but were read by all of these guys in the first half of the 20th century. Then the final part 5, is called Deicide. Deicide is, D-E-I is God, right? Deicide. So deicide is the death of God, is killing God. The first chapter here, the first article is The Death of God by Paulus Lens Medoc, and then the final one is called Satan in Our Day by Dom Alois Mager. And The Death of God was an incredibly interesting. He's a philosopher, the writer, and he tracks how from Leibniz in the early 18th century all the way to the 1950s and Nazism, philosophers have been consciously or unconsciously allowing reason and rationality to displace faith, and for reason and rationality to constrict revelation, to constrict and constrain the Bible. And eventually some major events would be Reimarus, who was a philosopher and philologist in the mid-18th century, basically saying, look, the Bible is so full of contradictions, it's just a document written by men. And then you have David Friedrich Strauss in the mid-19th century writing Life of Christ, saying, look, the Bible is a myth. The Gospels are myths. The New Testament reflects the beliefs of the people writing it, not anything having to do with reality. And then by the time you get to Heinrich Heine, a German man of letters, and then Friedrich Nietzsche, German philosopher, those two men can just straight up say, God is dead. We've killed him. Philosophy has pushed out God. We no longer need God to make sense of our world. We just need ourselves. Man is the measure of all things. So this article, he tracks that trajectory, and he basically says, I don't know what's in store for humanity in the future. And I'm thinking, man, he said that 70 years ago. If only he could say it today. So this book, if you can get your hands on it, is worth reading. It is absolutely fascinating. This review is way longer than I intended, but I hope you enjoy it and get something out of it. And in your spiritual warfare, rely on Christ fully in all things. Satan is the father of lies and is a murderer, as our Lord teaches. He works by deception. He works with falsehoods. He does not work with the truth. So where the truth is spoken and life is protected and Christ is proclaimed, you have nothing to fear from the devil. So thank you so much for listening, and God's peace, and stay tuned for our next book review. Take care and have a blessed remainder of the Lent.